Good evening, good evening. We can't see you, but welcome. Welcome, let's hear you. Well, DeRay and I were speaking just a little bit ago, and DeRay commented, and I think it will all resonate with all of us, that there's more than enough work to go around right now. And that's what we're here to talk about tonight. We're here to talk about change makers and their stories. And most importantly, we're here to get you thinking about the kind of change maker that you want to be. So with that, we all have stories. Our stories are not linear. We have a lot of twists and turns, a lot of dead ends. But the great thing about our stories is that when we get to tell them in reverse, they sound much more seamless. So what I'd like for you to share with us tonight, just to kick us off, is if you had to draw a straight line, and DeRay, this is coming to you.
I was like looking at Neal like, yeah.
I saw that, but it wasn't going to work. So if you had to draw a straight line between sitting here now and a place and a moment in time that got you here, where would that be? What would it be?
Yeah, it's an honor to be here. When I think about a moment that really changed everything, I used to teach 6th grade math in East New York, Brooklyn. Teaching was the hardest thing I've ever done. 6th grade is beautiful. 7th grade is puberty and deodorant and really bad, but 6th grade is like still really magical. And I learned a lot of things as a teacher that I carried with me through the protests and through all of the work in activism. So one of the things that I learned was this idea of, in teaching, it doesn't matter like how much effort you put in. You could stay up all night and it'd still be like the worst lesson you've ever taught in your entire life. In college, it was like effort always changed the outcome. If I stayed up late and like worked on the paper was better. If I crammed on the test, I did better on the test. And teaching was the first time that I really had to put in practice what it meant to like do the work smart, because like that was real. The second was, how do you deliver complicated ideas to people every day so they can get it? And so much of the work in the classroom was, I taught math, so it was like, some people don't like math, I get it. But it was like, how do I make equations sexy, right? How do I I swear to God, I never learned how to divide decimals until I was a teacher. And like, how do I do those things? And in the movement, so much of it is like, how do we communicate these complicated ideas to people as an activist? Like, how do I talk about the police in ways that help people understand what the issues are? And it's like, I don't have to hate the police. You don't have to hate the police to think that this institution should be different. So the classroom is probably like the point that I'd start out on the line to say that it set me up to do all of the things that I did afterwards.
Jordan, tell us about your straight line.
You know the story.
Yes, but everybody else needs to hear this story.
So the first thing I would say is that although, as Jen said, we all have our stories, tonight is really about you guys. It's about helping you connect to what you're uniquely encoded to do, about unleashing your power to make a difference in the world. And I think if DeRay, Neal, Jen, and I are successful, we'll spark some real action out in the world from the audience. So let's hope we can achieve that. In terms of my particular story, it starts in an unusual place north of the Arctic Circle in Alaska. And I was climbing a mountain. There was a terrible storm, wind slashing at my face. And I had what I call my dust in the wind moment. The world was conspiring to tell me that I didn't really matter. And it wasn't an intellectual thing. It was really a gut kind of knowing that I didn't really matter. And my ego dissolved, and I was just one with the universe. And I hated the message that I didn't matter. And I really was screaming at the wind saying, I do matter, but truth be told, I didn't know how. And so I came down from the mountain with that realization that I wanted to matter. It was my dare to matter moment. And that whether I was an eye doctor, a photographer, or a tundra biologist, all things that I was considering to do, it didn't really matter. What mattered was that I would use my energy and my unique abilities to make the world a better place. And then we fast forward about 6 months later. I was in rural Mexico. I had decided to study to be an optometrist, And we brought an eye care mission to Mexico, and there I was in front of a 7-year-old boy who was from the School for the Blind. The rub was he wasn't really blind. He just needed a super strong pair of glasses. I put the glasses on his face, and he saw for the first time. And as Mark Twain says, the 2 most important days of your life are the day you're born and the day you find out why. And for me, that was the day I found out why. And it was a moment that changed both myself and Raul inexorably. It was just a pivotal moment that I can point to.
Coming over to you, Neal.
Well, I came out of the womb wanting to sell glasses.
Were you wearing them also when you?
You know, I grew up in this great city. I was somebody that was very passionate around changing the world and used that vocabulary, but didn't really know how or what to do. I found that I was particularly interested in international relations and foreign policy, and went to college to study that, went to Tufts in Boston because of their international relations program. Thought that, you know, if we could get people to stop killing each other, then we could focus on the big things like health and education. And was interning at a think tank that came up with policies to resolve deadly conflict. And I realized that intellectually, right, the impact that I wanted to have, that fit, but the work I was doing day to day, it wasn't really my strength. I wasn't super excited to go into work. And a family friend introduced me to Jordan, and that was a pivotal moment in my life. For one thing, he started to tell me, hey, there's over 1 billion people on the planet that can't see because they don't have a very simple pair of glasses. And this is technology that's been around for about 800 years. And that sort of, you know, really sunk in. It's like, we're failing as a species when we can't make technology that is this old widely accessible to everybody. And he talked about this idea to train women in these communities where people are living on less than $4 a day to start their own businesses, giving vision screenings and selling glasses in their communities, so that they could earn a livelihood, and then you could provide this product that would help people reach their potential. And suddenly, right, that was super, super exciting, right? Sometimes you just need someone to frame a problem and a solution, and that got me super jazzed. And Jordan took a bet on me, and he was starting this nonprofit, and I moved down to El Salvador, started working on the pilot program, and kept working at it, and spent about 5 years doing that at Jordan's nonprofit, Vision Spring. Had the opportunity to expand it to about 10 different countries, and that then led me to business school, to my co-founders, and that's where we came up with Warby Parker. Wow.
You're all doing, yeah. Clap if you're wearing Warby Parker glasses right now. Oh.
Thank you.
We talk a lot about change, and we talk about it as if there's one kind of change. But language, as DeRay has often said and written, language is really important. In the creation story in Genesis, in fact, the entire world is brought into being by God speaking the world into being. So language is one of the building blocks of creating a world. So I was hoping that we could talk a little bit about change, not in an amorphous way, but how you understand the work of change. Words like hope generally go with the word change, right? Faith. How do you understand these words, and how do they inform the work that each of you has chosen to do and the work that has chosen you?
Any particular
It
order?
seems unfair to make DeRay go first again, so Neal.
Yeah. I think one of the things that we talk a lot about is the word impact. And I think the nice thing about the word impact is that it's not very nuanced yet, right? Like impact is sort of cause and effect. You do something and it has an impact. And that impact generally can be positive, neutral, or negative. Actually, it's rarely neutral, right? It's usually one or the other with obviously degrees in between. So if we just talk about impact and then we have to decide what is the descriptor we're going to put in front of that. Because we're all having impacts, intended or unintended. So how do we make what we're doing have positive impact? So that's something that we talk a lot about at Warby Parker, just that word impact.
From my perspective, change is essential to any kind of business or organization because organizations are dynamic living entities. And if Vision Spring didn't change its model over and over and over again, we would never be in a place where now we've reached over 5.5 million people. It's the other word that I think about when I hear change is flexibility. And an entrepreneur, whether a business entrepreneur or a social entrepreneur, has to remain flexible as data comes in from their customers, from the ecosystem, so that they can iterate their model, because there's no entrepreneur that I know whose idea ended up manifesting exactly like the business was an exact manifestation of their idea. Maybe Google was the only one, but other than that, it's pretty hard to find.
I'd say a couple things come to mind. When we think about organizing young people, we often say that young people have the experiences before they have the language. And part of our work is not to penalize them for not having the language, but to try and get as close to the experience as possible. And I think about that all the time, this notion that we also say in organizing that language is often the first act, that what is a border but a definition, right? That defining the terms is often and almost always an act of power. So you think about young people, it's like, there are young people all across the country who live in food deserts but don't have the language of a food desert, which doesn't make their experience any less real. And how do we get close to people's experiences as they build the language and not penalize them for that? And then how do we make sure that the words that we use, we actually define in real ways? So we, in movement spaces, we often talk about justice and accountability, and people use the words interchangeably. But what we would say is that accountability is what happens after the trauma. Justice is the fact that people shouldn't experience the trauma in the first place, right? Not the same thing, similar, but not the same. And the more and more that we tease it out and help people do that, the more and more we help them actually refine the work that they're gonna do. And the third thing that I'd say is, and especially as somebody, I do most of my work is around police and mass incarceration, and I'm in a lot of rooms where people are like, oh, you hate the police, or all this other stuff. And part of it is how do we use words to paint this picture? Because so much of justice work is about telling a story about a world that we believe is possible, but we've never seen before. So I believe we can live in a world where the police don't kill people. I've never seen that world before. I can talk to you about it. I've not seen it. I believe we can live in a world where everybody has access to healthcare and to glasses, and everybody's vision is not impaired. I believe that world is possible. We've not seen that world before. And so much of our work is to tell that story, though, about a world we believe in and have never seen. And language is how we do that. So when I'm in rooms with the police, sometimes they'll say to me, are you saying that the police should never kill somebody? And I say to them, when should the police kill your child, right? When would it be okay for a police officer to put a bullet through your kid's head? And they're like, I don't know. It's well, I don't know either, right? They're like, if you can't think of it, I can't think of it. But those are ways that we use language to sort of push people to think deeper. And it's one of the reasons why we don't say things like police brutality anymore. That brutality seems really episodic to people because you don't use the word brutal often in your day-to-day life. Violence seems way more consistent. So we talk about police violence because the language helps us do more work than we could do otherwise. And the last year, I'll never forget, it was during the protest. We were in the street in St. Louis for 400 days, and one night in front of the Ferguson PD, there were a lot of fights amongst protesters. There was just a lot of fighting happening. And the news crews happened to be there. So they have this crystal clear footage of people fighting each other. And I'm on the news the next day, defending the protest about something. And she says to me, DeRay, but you told me this was nonviolent. And then it pans to fist fights. And I pause and I say to her, me and my sister fought all the time as kids, and I never questioned my love for her. And it was like, how do we use language to like not feed into what they're trying to do, right? Like, how do we repackage a moment of conflict as a moment of conflict and not as a moment of violence, right? And that is the work of language.
You also talk about proximity, and I think that that's essential when we're trying to find where we fit in the puzzle of creating that world that we imagine, but we've never seen before. And imagination is really important. Proximity is important too, because it's how we get pointed in the direction of the need that needs us most. So maybe if we could talk a little bit about how you got proximate to a problem, and when was a moment where you knew that the work was choosing you? So where were you in one of those moments where you were so close to something that it touched you in a different way than all other problems in the world, because there are a lot of them, right? And where that proximity changed you and let you know that you couldn't not do that work and still live a full life, be fully who you are.
I'll start that one. I talk sometimes about APA, anger, proximity, action, because all three are necessary. A lot of entrepreneurs, particularly entrepreneurs who are trying to solve an intractable problem, start by getting pissed off at something that really irks them, and they see a world, as DeRay was saying, that they don't want to see and believe that there's another world that should come into existence. So a lot of the original motivation is just a feeling of anger. And I remember being in Mexico and Latin America and parts of Africa, just feeling that it was a complete injustice that people didn't have access to a simple pair of glasses. I saw kids falling out of school. I saw adults falling out of the workforce prematurely because of a lack of a pair of glasses that we could source for $1. It just was ridiculous. So that got me pissed off. And that ended up bringing me to become proximate to my patients and to really understand what their needs were. And I remember one proximate moment that was very profound for me. I was in southern India in the state of Tamil Nadu, and we were screening 17,000 people. And I was in the line that had to determine where the patients went. Did they go to get glasses? Did they go to get surgery? And a 75-year-old woman came to me, and she was my next patient, one after the other, and she had blinding cataracts. And I went to examine her eyes to see if there was any ability to look at her retina. And when you examine someone's eye like that, you have to lean really close in. And as I got to basically her face, I smelled a smell of soil, of earth. And it brought me back to that moment that I was in Alaska. And she and I just became one. It was that one of those feelings again where I dissolved a difference between me and her. And that's really the moment that I learned about compassion. So because we became fused and we became one person. And it was strange for a Jewish boy from Scarsdale to be one with a 75-year-old a woman in India, but I felt like we were the same person at that moment. And I would never have had that powerful feeling if I wasn't literally proximate to that patient.
So physically, proximate.
It was physical in this case.
What that physicality, is that integral to proximity? Because sometimes we think of a problem and it's sort of out there, but is it possible to even begin to understand how to work to fix something if you don't have physical proximity to either people or the challenge that's really making your insides churn?
I think the physical proximity, so I'd push and say that there's a difference between proximity to trauma and proximity to work. And I think that people, especially in movement spaces, I think people confuse the two, that like, both my parents were addicted to drugs. My mother left when I was 3, came back when I was 30. I have proximity to the trauma of addiction, but that doesn't make me automatically like an expert on addiction. Doesn't mean that I like should be in spaces telling people what to do or like how to solve it, but that is proximity to trauma. It's not necessarily proximity to work, that I actually have to do something to be proximate to the work of ending addiction. And I think people confuse it too often in this space because people sort of see their proximity to trauma as like the validator. And I'd push and say that we have to make sure that we are proximate to both, that like it wasn't simply being proximate to people who didn't have glasses. It was like doing the work of saying like, how do we get people glasses? And like, I think it's like a both and, not an either or. I think people confuse that a lot. It's one of the reasons why I don't talk about public education publicly often, not because I didn't love being a teacher, I did, and I was the chief human capital in the school system in Baltimore, but there are a lot of people who literally, they're like experts on public education because they were students, and you're like, that's not good enough, right? Like that is, like literally, it makes me want to blow my, I'm like, what is going on? They're like, but you know, this is, and I'm like, well, what's that? And they're like, because my teacher in 7th grade, I'm like, okay, this is nuts. But that is like a great example of like proximate to trauma. Like you had an experience that made a lot of sense to you. You don't necessarily understand the work that's happening, and like we actually have to do something to understand the work a little better. So I believe in proximity. I want to believe that we need to do both and I think too often we talk about one, not the other.
For you, that proximity to need, how does that manifest itself for you in your work and in your life? Because by the way, they're not separate. Work is part of it.
Yeah, as I think about sort of what I was motivated to study, right, geographically, it was pretty not proximate, right? Thinking about war zones far outside the borders of the United States. As I think about even getting into international development, again, that was pretty far away. Obviously, doing the work and living in these different communities makes it a lot more real and was highly motivating to continue to go further, but also to learn how best to serve communities, right? If you're not in the communities, how do you know all the nuances and the unintended consequences of some of the work that you're doing? It was interesting, right? One of the first lessons that we learned while we were training folks to start businesses selling glasses was that we figured, we can actually train somebody in a couple of weeks. But they weren't necessarily accepted by their neighbors as somebody that knew how to give a vision test and sell glasses, because they were like, I've grown up with you. You've lived in the house next to me your whole life. You didn't go to the Capitol. You didn't go to school for many years. How am I going to trust that you know how to provide a vision test and sell me glasses? So what we started to do is actually put up banners that would say, back then called these folks vision entrepreneurs or vision advisors, asesoras visuales, and we would literally make a banner that people would hang outside their home that would say vision entrepreneurs in training. And we'd leave it there for 6 months, even though they were fully equipped. And actually, one of the things that we would train people to do is actually go to the neighboring village as opposed to your own town, because there people don't know you. And to some extent, it's true in New York City. It's a strength of weak ties, actually. So I think proximity allows you to better understand, better work, but it's not always necessarily needed to motivate. One of the things that we do at Warby Parker to do a better job connecting, people that are working in headquarters or in our manufacturing facility or in our stores to our broader mission is on people's 3rd-year anniversary. We actually will send them on a trip to see the amazing work of Vision Spring and some of our other nonprofit partners. And for some of our team members, it's the first time they're getting a passport, and it's really awesome. They get to travel to Mexico or the Dominican Republic or Nicaragua and see what it means for someone to put on a pair of glasses for the very first time and see what Jordan saw many, many times, and someone's eyes light up and their grin reach ear to ear. It's pretty special.
DeRay, you talked a little bit about your parents and your background, and I think that there's a lot of personal work that's involved when you're trying to figure out the pain point in the world, in your community, that you want to heal. It seems like it's almost impossible to do that without also looking at your own pain points and doing some healing of self. What were some moments for you, Jordan, when you knew that in order to be a change maker, that you would also have to do some work of personal change?
Well, I think the personal change is an ongoing battle that anyone who is a change maker has to start with themselves, because the environment in which you work is always changing, and there's always ways in which you can improve yourself, whether it's as a leader, as a partner, as a mentor, as a mentee. So all change starts with yourself. And so I've always tried to listen really carefully to the kind of feedback that I'm getting from the people who I work with, whether it's negative or positive. I remember one area that early on in Vision Springs history, where we were trying to get resources, and all of the foundations we went to were saying, well, you don't have a randomized controlled trial proving that glasses make a difference and that glasses help people. And I'm like, that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. I said, we have two choices here. We could either maybe take a day where every one of your employees doesn't wear your glasses, and at the end of the day, ask them were they more or less productive that day, or we can spend $500,000 on a randomized controlled trial. Now, I was being a little flippant, but the fact of the matter was the right thing to do was to collect the evidence that was indisputable and that we could bring to ministries of health and finance and foundations. And so I was resistant to that for many years, but then I found I was getting in the way of the organization's progress. And so over time, we have done many now randomized controlled trials in different settings, from farms to factories, and they are in fact a critical piece of information that help us attract money and grow.
I think for me, there are three things come to mind. First is like, what does success look like? I remember when I was young, it was like make six figures and da-da-da, like that was what I thought success looked like. And I was a special assistant in the school system in Baltimore. I made six figures and my life didn't like dramatically change. It wasn't like I was like happier. It was cool, but it wasn't like suddenly, I was still working till 3 o'clock in the morning, so I was like, I couldn't do anything cool with the money anyway. And like so that was like a big, and I did it so young, I was probably like 25 or 26. And that was like a big moment of like, what does success really look like? Because as a teacher, and I was a very good teacher, and I worked very hard, and it almost killed me, and it was great though. But in the classroom, it really was, but it was hard, it was very hard. My second year in the classroom, I taught all of 6th grade math by Christmas. I taught the year's worth of curriculum in the first couple months of the school year, and then I taught 7th through 11th grade algebra from January to June. 40% of my kids got the highest score you could get in the state of New York. My kids did very well, but it was really hard. And like, I'll never forget seeing them learn and seeing people walk into my classroom and sort of be like, are your kids factoring polynomials? And I'm like, yeah. And they're like, but that's not that. And I'm like, they can do it. It was like seeing that sort of like doing the impossible was something that was like, I was very proud of. And that sort of became a new metric of what success looked like. And I was like, that was big for me. The second, I write about this in the book, is like, what does it mean to be worthy? So my mother left when I was 3, came back when I was 30. And for a long time, I would walk into every room, not like this idea that if she could leave, anybody could leave, right? That like, if she didn't want to stay, then why would anybody stay? And I would walk into every room with this idea of like, what does it mean to be worthy? That I was always sort of dealing with this question of worthiness in every single room I was in. And it wasn't until recently-ish that I was able to like name that and make sure that that didn't hurt the people around me or myself. And that was big. And the third was, what does it mean to keep learning even when we are experts in spaces? So I spend a lot of time around policing and mass incarceration. I know more than most. And every day I still am learning a ton. And like, I'm open to that and I'm excited about it. And I think about the stuff that I just like, every day I'm like, wow, like a third of all the people killed by a stranger is killed by a police officer. Which is wild. And there are all these studies and all these things that like, even though I know a lot, I still don't know everything, and that's okay. And there was a point in time where like, that wasn't okay, where I was like, I gotta know everything. I walk into rooms feeling inadequate. And now I'm like, it feels like I just don't know the coolest thing yet. And the classroom was really, I keep talking about being a teacher, it was hard. But on the really hard days, I would tell myself that I just hadn't found the gift yet. Like that would be what I would do when I go home. I'd be like, that was really bad. And I'm like, it wasn't bad. I just hadn't found the gift yet. And that helped me out a lot.
I love that you haven't found the gift yet. How do you get to a point where you start identifying what your signature talents are, your unique talents that you can deploy to do this work of change, so that you're not making giant shifts in your life. You're actually looking at, okay, what's in my toolkit? What do I bring, and how can I use it? So what did you find in your toolkit, Neal?
I feel like I need to do some more reflection. You know, I'm not sure where this came from, but there's have a mentality, and we have it at Warby Parker, which is just about how do we just make progress every single day, and how do we learn and adapt, and we often talk about this analogy of how do we de-risk challenging situations or something that we don't know how to do. And I think you do that by just making incremental progress every single day. And baby steps actually can add up to a lot of progress. But there are moments where when I feel like I have to take a giant leap of faith, I actually take a step back and figure out how can I solve this problem incrementally in smaller pieces. Maybe I'm trying to solve something that's, and this is not very motivational, but might be a little too big. Can I start to chip away at it? And we often describe this internally as like a startup mentality. Like startups need to create the future in which they're going to be successful. Legacy businesses, incumbents, they want to maintain the status quo because that's where they're having the most success. So one of my biggest fears for Warby Parker as we continue to scale and grow is how do we make sure that we're always have a startup mindset and not that of an incumbent.
It seems like increments are really important when you're trying to do big things, when you're trying to make big change. And I think we're living in a time right now where we are all so overwhelmed by all of the need in the world. We are surrounded, we've got wall-to-wall screens everywhere telling us every hour of every day everything that's broken. And I think we all want to do something. So how do we live in that world where we're completely overwhelmed? We also have lives and people are counting on us, and we also want to experience joy and love and pleasure because that's part of being human, and so that's allowed. And we also want to leave the world a better place because we were in it. We want to use the time that we have and our gifts to make a difference. So how do you do that? How do you start making incremental changes and getting to some part that you can go to work on, and so that it feels manageable, but really wonderfully challenging at the same time?
I think, I'll ask everybody a question. The question is about arrests. So what percentage of arrests that happen in the country do you think happen for violent crime? So of all the arrests that happen in the country, what percentage do you think happen for violent crime? If you think more than 50% of the arrests that happen are for violent crime, raise your hand. In between 40 and 50%? 30 and 40%? You have to raise your hand at some point. Okay. 20 and 30%? 10 and 20%? Less than 10%. It is 5%. And I say that because some of our work is to bust the myths. Some of our work is to reorient people to what is actually true and what's not true, so that we can help people fight for the world that they deserve a little bit better. So when I think about this incrementalism thing, it's I actually am anti-increment because I think that we can change the stuff really quickly. It's if they can change the tax code in the single biggest rewrite of the tax code in the history of the country in 5 days on scrap paper, then don't tell me that we can't change. We can change all of this really quickly because they did that. That actually happened. happened, you know? There'll be a point when like 1 in 8 judges on the federal bench are appointed by this current president. Like we've never, they are like a case study in like why we don't necessarily have to think about things in increments. We can actually do things in full swoops. We just have to believe that we deserve that, and like how do we fight for that? But again, some of it is like orienting people to what is true and what's not true, because myths, just like the legacy businesses, sort of want the status quo to continue. That like if you believe that 40% of the arrests that happen in the country for violent crime, you're more likely to believe that the police are the answer. Jails and prisons make a lot of sense, but 5% arrests for violent crime, if you think about 5%, less than 5% is actually convictions, right? So 5% of the arrests, not everybody arrested is actually convicted of a crime. That like violence is not happening in ways that you think it's happening. And like I want to believe that that's a part of it. The second is like we should really fight for what we believe we deserve, not what we think we can get. And I think that so many of us fight for what we think we can get because we've not gotten things before, as opposed to fighting for what we think we deserve. I think the other side fights always for what they think they can deserve, what they think they can deserve. You know, like that is what the battle is every time. And sometimes we're like, well, I think we can just get this thing. And it's like, that is not good enough, right? So the increment should be what we fall back on when we didn't get the big win, but we should always fight for the big win.
Jordan, how do you jump in? How do you start? Everyone wants to find their way in, their on-ramp, their entry point. How do you just get moving?
Well, for me, what was instrumental for me to start moving was to feel what lifted my heart. There were certain moments when I was working in the field in Mexico, serving thousands of people at a time, where my just heart was constantly lifted. I felt like I was drinking coffee constantly, and it wasn't an effort, it was just momentum, and there was a heart lifting that led to a fire in the belly, and it wasn't at all intellectual, it was all feeling. And I knew that I was in my zone, and we've all been in those zones. And so the first thing to, I think, know is what that feels like, and to be sensitive to it and to listen to it. And I think a lot of people have had those feelings, but they don't take them seriously enough, and they don't use them as a way to direct their lives. And so when you have those kinds of feelings, appreciate them, pause, understand them, capture them, and let it lead you to action.
So, yes. I think we don't trust ourselves enough to know when there's a moment that's speaking to us. So if we quiet ourselves and we're open to it and we meet it, as we say, the world will conspire to help us. There are a lot of questions that folks have for all of you. So what advice, Neal, can you give? It doesn't say Neal on here, but I'm just giving you a heads up. What advice can you give a young person to help them leave the hurt in the past and strive to achieve greatness?
You know, I think the first thing is, in getting started, a lot of us found our passions by just jumping into a job, and sometimes you might realize what you're not passionate about, and that can be equally as important to help you sort of figure out what it is you want to do to then achieve whatever it is that you want to achieve, right? That intersection of where your strengths and your skill sets are and what you're passionate about. And I just find that it's often difficult to do that without having a variety of experiences, or at least working in some capacity. You know, I'm often asked, how do I become an entrepreneur? How do I start a business? And you can start one without any experience, but usually the richer, more experiences that you have better pattern recognition of identifying problems and then coming up with solutions for them. But one easy thing to do would be every day write down frustrations. Maybe you have a handful in a given day by the end of the week. You could have scores of the frustrations by the end of the month, maybe hundreds, and there might be a mission in there to create change or a business opportunity.
So you don't ever leave it all behind. You find a way to turn it into one of your powers. Right? DeRay, how has your life changed since you left your career as a teacher and became an activist?
Everything, it's I don't even what can I say? 11-year-olds are very different than a police, so that's a big difference. If anything, I think definitely in the classroom and definitely before the protests began, I would have said that it's about better people, that we need better teachers, better principals, better prosecutors, better judges. Like that was sort of my lens. And 5 years into the protest, I'm now obsessed with never letting the system off the hook. That I now understand that even the best programs often exist because the system failed in the first place, right? So the goal isn't to have a really dope program that feeds homeless people under the bridge. The goal is to have no more homeless people because we've guaranteed housing, right? The goal isn't to have a million amazing after-school programs that teach kids how to read. The goal is to have a public school system that teach kids how to read during the school day, right? And I think that I just didn't. I think I could have said that, but I didn't understand it. So now you think about the police. It's police departments are fine. They are okay with the protests. They are whatever about the protests these days because they understand that most of the protests are about a singular incident, right? Not about the system. And it's until we change things at the system level, the outcomes will never change. And I'll say that in the past 5 years, I think that what is true is that we've certainly changed the conversation. We've not yet changed the outcomes, right? The police actually killed more people in 2017 and 2018 than 2014. The police are killing more people since the protests began, not less. And people don't understand that because they're but I've seen a video, I've seen it on the news, and the conversation changing isn't the same thing as the outcomes changing. And that is very different. I'm obsessed with how do we make sure the outcomes change. I think that in the classroom I learned how to see systems better, to see the impact that systems have on people's lives, to see how people can change. I remember teaching my kids negative numbers and them being what's below zero, and it being a shocking, you'd have thought that I just blew up the world. And then by the end of the year, it's they're fighting me, being well, you didn't do that. And I'm I remember when you did. That changed my life, that was really big. But now I'm obsessed with how do we make sure systems change? And what does that mean so that outcomes change? Because most of the things we measure, the outcomes are still really bad. That people are, somebody asked me yesterday, I live in Baltimore. They were there's a new police chief in Baltimore. And Baltimore's a tough city. And he was have you met the new police chief? And I was no. And he's but he's a good guy. And I was okay. Here's the thing. In the past 2 weeks, we've had 2 mass shootings. 18 people got shot over the weekend. The police just killed somebody who they said had a gun. He didn't have a gun. And then a 1-year-old got shot. So it's only with poor people and people of color that we praise people for being nice when the outcomes haven't changed, right? And I'm obsessed with a conversation about the outcomes.
Jordan, someone wants to know why part of your change work now has included writing about your change work. You certainly didn't need to. You need to write a book about it. So what for you is the inspiration for doing that?
Well, there's sort of a corollary. When I was meeting that 7-year-old boy in Mexico, I was in the same chair for 6 days, 12 hours a day, seeing patient after patient. And at the end of the 7 days or so of being there, the line was just as long as when we got there. And I said, I've got to get my butt out of this seat. There's got to be a better way to do this. I've got to figure out how to leverage myself and really make myself effective. I needed to leverage myself significantly. And as we have the opportunity to speak about Vision Spring across the country and tell people the story of Vision Spring as a great example of social entrepreneurship, the same questions kept coming up over and over again. And they went something like this. I want to live a good life. I've got this fancy education. I want to get a good job. but I don't want to do it at the expense of having purpose and meaning in my life. How do I do that? How do I integrate those two things? And coming to think of that question, it's really been my central struggle and narrative in my life. And so I felt rather than be the guy in the chair going one audience at a time, by writing the book, we might be able to provide a greater number of people with handles of how to think about integrating money and meaning in their lives so that they could have a full and integrated life.
Neal, what does the future hold for Warby Parker in terms of social good and social change?
We're spending a lot of time also figuring out how do we get glasses to kids in schools, and it's a slightly different approach than a lot of our work with Vision Spring, for example. We're working in New York City and in Baltimore, those are two cities where that can serve as the example of how we expand from city to city. So in Baltimore, for example, one of the first things that we were testing is what if we provide 2 pairs of glasses to students? One that stay at the school and one that the child can take home. So that way there's always a pair of glasses, right, in the school. So when during classes, right, the students wearing a pair of glasses. Other things that we've been testing is what is the number of options that we need to provide to kids so that way they choose a pair of glasses that they're excited about, that they take pride in wearing. Right, a pair of glasses is a core part of somebody's identity, and just because somebody might not already own a pair of glasses or might not have a high level of wealth, right, it doesn't mean that they shouldn't look good and feel good. So our design team designs 40 different options for kids to choose from. And right, we're measuring the outcomes of that based on are people wearing the glasses? Are we seeing reading scores improved? And our thought is that if we can do this in Baltimore, if we can do it in New York City, the largest public school system in the country, 1.1 million students, we think over 200,000 don't have the glasses that they need. If we can figure this out, then we can scale it to other municipalities, other states, and really solve this issue holistically.
Are kids' glasses cheaper to make?
Not really. There's a little less material, but not much. You know, it's funny, we started selling children's glasses as part of our general assortment at Warby Parker. And in the first 2 months, we actually found 70% of the people buying the glasses were actually women, just with narrow faces. And we realized we need more narrow frames.
That's a common problem.
Yeah.
That's so random.
The feedback that we were getting from some of our customers was like, we're completely comfortable buying these frames that you're marketing towards children because they're priced at the same amount, so we know that they're the same quality.
Interesting. Okay.
DeRay, what is one of the most memorable moments you've gotten to see during a Black Lives Matter protest, and why did it stand out?
Oh, so many memorable moments. These are like hard. I'm like, for so long. I'll say a moment. This is sort of an unconventional. It's easy to tell you a moment in the street. I'll tell you, we met with President Obama twice, and the longest meeting he ever had in the White House was with us. It was around issues of policing. It was 3 hours. It was like 3 hours and 10 minutes, and at the third hour, you're like, okay, I think the meeting's over. It's like, we've been here for a long time. And I'll never forget, it was just 3 protesters in the room. It was like 30 people, maybe 25 people in the room, police chiefs, mayors. I'd gotten arrested in Baton Rouge. I just got out of jail, and then we're at this White House meeting. And one of the things that it was a long 17 hours in that jail cell. But one of the things that we always say is this idea of like, will you bring the truth with you into every room? There are a lot of people who like tell the truth until they get into the room, and then like the truth sort of disappears. And that's how it is with Obama. So I will say that his administration did not do much about police violence. Like they didn't. They wrote a really great report. Brittany, one of our partners, was on the task force. I wrote the report. The report is good. That was it. And one of the reasons I'm not so upset with him about it is that, like, what is true is that not a lot of people pushed Obama. They didn't. So we go in this room, and everybody, it's like all these people, and they're like, thank you, President Obama. And we're like, thank you? He hasn't done anything. Like, what are you thanking him for? And there was a police chief from St. Paul, and one of the activists from Minneapolis was in the room. And I don't know what he said. Like, we were going around, and he said something slick. You know, the police had just killed Philando Castile. And he said something like about those rowdy protesters or something. And we're like in this room in the White House, and she just yells across the room, like, you don't get to say that in this room or any room. And I'm like, okay, here we go. And then he yells back. So they're like yelling in this White House meeting. And I go, and I know her, like I got her in the room. So I'm about to like say something to her. And then I look, I'm like, well, if the president is letting them yell, I guess we just yell today, right? Like, I guess we just hear everything. So they're like, the police chief and this activist, they are like literally going back and forth. And everybody's looking at Obama like, what is he about to do? Because we don't know what to do. And he looks at her and he says, I want to hear you. That's like how he called her. He said, I want to hear you. It was great. And she sort of calms down, and he mispronounces her name, and she's like, that is not how you say my name. And it was like this awesome moment. And it was great, though, because like what happens so often is that people will tell the truth everywhere, like, and not where it matters the most, you know? And it was like beautiful to see her just hold this ground about being really honest in a room where, like, it was all these people, she loved Obama. There were all these people that she cared about, but it was like, you just killed somebody. Like, the police killed Philando, and like, you all saw it on TV, and you don't get to like make fun of that in any room, and I'll hold you accountable in every room. And like, I'll never forget how proud I was of her in that moment, and to just be an activist in that moment. And the same thing, we went with Bernie, and at the end of the first meeting with Bernie, he goes, he was like, did I earn your vote? And one of the people with us, she goes, no, not today. He was like, really? And she was like, yeah, this was not a great meeting. And it was, one of those things where like, he just hadn't heard, you know, and it wasn't even to be slick. It was just like, just to be honest, today was not your day, right? And those are some of the moments that I'm like the most proud to have been a part of.
Nice.
So everybody can have those moments. All you have to decide to do is be in the room or step out your door. You have to decide, are you going to be the person who changes the world with your feet, with your hands, with your heart, with your head? What room do you want to be in? What truth do you have to bring to the table? And what truths do you not yet know that you have to listen to? That's what this night is about. We've got different people doing different work, but the work of change is a lot of heavy lifting. So I'm going to ask everyone to stand up. I know, it's weird. Stand. You're not going to have to sing anything. You're not going to have to talk to your neighbor. This is all you. Jordan and I heard Indaba Mandela speak the other night, and so this is with thanks to him and also to Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. Put your hands out in front of you and repeat after me. I am. Unprecedented. Exceedingly precious. And I refuse. To gamble away. The meaning of my life. Now close your eyes. Picture one person, one place, one thing that you want to change. And imagine with your hands extended that you're reaching out to another person. Who is that person? Where is that person? And don't forget to hold on and don't let go. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you.